I'm Tracy Rochelle High. I'm a member of the Center's Advisory Board. I'm also co-head of the Labor and Employment Group at Sullivan and Cromwell. I'm going to keep all of our bios very short so that we can get into the content. So I'm going to start with Daniel, who is a fellow of the Society of Labor Economists, a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Institute for the Study of Labor, as well as past president of the Society of Labor Economists and of the Midwest Economics Association. Everybody's bios are in your wonderful packets. We're green, as you remember. So if you haven't printed them, you can assess them online, but I'm not going to spend much more time giving intros than that. The purpose of the intros is to let you know you are speaking with people who know what they're talking about. Ye is director at Resolution Economics. That's a consulting firm with offices in many locations in the United States. He holds various degrees from various prestigious universities. Both our former professors have written a lot in this area. And then, funny enough, we also have Jerry as another facilitator. You all really need to be facilitated here. At Fox Rothschild, he conducts a lot of L&E-related work, and against that backdrop, I'm going to edit myself and turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Am I on?
You are
Okay,
on.
great, I am on. As you can see, my main affiliation is a university in a state that is the Voldemort of states today, apparently. Okay, so that's where I spend most of my time. One of my students many years ago, I taught immense numbers of introductory students, said the course I was teaching should be called Graphology 101. And I'll abide by that by showing basically a bunch of graphs and talking around them. Okay, this is a graph somewhere over there and over there, which shows the history of the unemployment rate in the U.S. for the last 20 years. And if you look very carefully, you will see at near the end here, it is very, very low. It's been now low longer than any time since the late 1960s, okay, which I think is quite remarkable. One of the reasons it's been low, and this is a shocking graph to any labor economist beyond the age of 50, which I probably am by a few years, is that the participation rate, the fraction of people either working or seeking work, which rose like crazy from the time I got into this business in the mid-60s until 2000, as you can see from the graph, has fallen since then. Of course, it took a plummet during the COVID crisis and went back up a little bit, but the trend has been remarkably downward. The fraction of adults, people 16 and over, who are working or looking for work has been going down. We talk about labor shortages. More than any other cause of that is the declining interest in working. Is this good or bad? I've written a lot about why I think Americans work too damn hard. I think this is wonderful. Other people don't like it at all. Employers are not real happy about this either. Next thing to note, and this is, I think, even more remarkable in some ways, this graph shows the ratio of unemployed to vacancies. Number of people seeking work who are unemployed, number of job openings. We've only had data on this since 2000, but we have a few snippets from way before then. In most cases over our history, unemployed have exceeded vacancies by a lot. Of course, you can see it rose during the recessions in 2009 and the COVID. Right now, it's below 1. There are more jobs-seeking workers than workers seeking jobs. An incredibly tight labor market. Despite that, you look in the papers, and every week somebody is saying we're on the threshold of a recession. A recession is nearly certain. There was a story this Monday in Business Insider with some economists saying that. It reminds me of an anecdote about a long-since deceased Wall Street expert who is reputed to have predicted 9 of the most recent 5 recessions, okay, which I think is exactly what we see now. Again, prediction's a tough business, and I'm not a macroeconomist, thank God. But nonetheless, I don't see a recession coming at all. And I think things are incredibly tight, and there are things happening in the labor market that, in fact, suggest it may be tighter. This is a map, you should be familiar with this, by state of whether they are constrained by the federal FLSA minimum wage. And as you can see, large numbers of states, covering about 2/3 of the workforce, the FLSA 7.25 an hour is not what's relevant. There's a higher minimum wage, going up to as much as 15 or even a little bit higher. Okay? So that's quite remarkable, I think. And you think about what might happen to it. Will it become more or less important? Well, let's say Trump gets reelected. I mean, I see a pall over people's faces. Let's say Trump gets reelected in the fall and follows through with his proposal to get rid of 11 million undocumented immigrants. That's what he's proposed. Okay? I don't know if it's possible. I doubt it. But let's say he does. I think if that happens, the minimum wage will become even less important than it is now, because there's going to be tremendous tightness at the lower end of the skill distribution. And wages will have to rise, although, of course, a lot of firms will go out of business because they can't afford it. So that's one thing to think about. We talked, I think, the director, the solicitor, talked about the FLSA regulation that just came out. And this sounds wonderful. I remember how excited I was when in 2016 the Obama administration came out, and my excitement disappeared a few months later when it was struck down. I don't know if this will be struck down, but let's say it isn't and it really happens. So this graph shows you in the blue the ratio of the ceiling to the average, that is the FLSA presumptively exempt amount, to the average salary of salaried workers in the United States, which is today almost $100,000, okay? Well, even with, this is an old one, even with the exempt amount changing under this regulation, why, it will still only be about 67% of the median. In '79, it was 200% of the median wage. It fell like crazy down to about 45 or 50, and with this, it'll rise up to 67. In other words, this regulation, which I'm all in favor of, in no way is restoring the fraction of people who are salaried who might be non-exempt, possibly depending upon their duties. What's amazing also, and this is just striking to anybody who looks at labor markets elsewhere, is how huge a fraction of American workers are salaried. No other country does this. And you'd think over time, as the economy gets more service, more trade-oriented, the fraction of salaried would be rising. But in fact, okay, it's still about half of the people are salaried, and nearly half are also hourly. So very few other countries have hourly workers. You get a salary defined over some period of time, a week or a month. Some other facts here to look at graphs on. This is union membership. That was as high as 30% at one point in the mid-50s. It's now down to about 10%. If you look at the private sector, it's headed down below 6%. I mean, yeah, I lived in Texas for 30 years. Unions didn't matter there. But in terms of the impact on labor markets, it's not clear how much they matter nationwide. Every month or two, you see a story in the papers about some union election indicating that a resurgence of unions is coming very, very soon. Well, I don't see it. This looks at NLRB, and most of you might know this. I don't know how novel this is, but it was a bit striking to me. It just ain't happening. In fact, the fraction of union winning elections, it's gone up a little bit. Number of elections bounces around, certainly hasn't gone up. So in terms of a resurgence of unionism, there was a Volkswagen win a couple of months ago, you remember in Tennessee. That generated a lot of press. But just this week, Mercedes voted the other way in Alabama, I think. And that's not, so I just don't see a big resurgence of unionism at all in this country. You may want it, you may not, but it just is not real important. One thing that might be important, or some people think it is the 4-day work week. Okay? There was a huge amount of press about this a year ago based on some alleged experiment in the UK. It wasn't an experiment. They got people who said, yeah, we're interested in doing it. And they said, wow, that worked out well for the companies that wanted to do it. This is not a surprise to any economist or anybody who evaluates programs of any kind, okay? Is the 4-day work week coming? Yeah, look at that. Wow. You take full-time workers, it was only 2% in 1973, and it's now about 6%, 6.5%. Is it the wave of the future? I would call it the ripple of the future. It's hardly a rising tide. Okay. Recently, my fellow alum from Chicago, Bernie Sanders, you might have heard of him, proposed again a mandatory 4-day, 32-hour week. Of course, this is not going to happen like anything else Bernie has proposed. B, okay, I mean, that's the true fact. There's no question about that. B, it's also the case that he hasn't thought about what that would imply about employment. There is absolutely no question, and if labor costs, this is my life's work on labor demand, that if labor costs go up, employment goes down. And there's no question that this would increase employment, if for no other reason than any hours beyond 32 would be subject to mandatory overtime penalties. Okay? That raises labor costs. It would cut hours of work per person, but it would also cut employment in total. There's no question. Labor costs would go up, employment would go down. Maybe that's not the worst thing. I don't know. But there is a costly endeavor. Whether we want to bear the cost in this rich economy, it's a matter of political judgment, not economics. Finally, what is wage fixing? Okay, I was involved in a couple of cases. I don't know if anybody here was involved in a series of cases involving nurses' wages. If anybody was, these are about 10, 12 years ago. Those are just two of them. One was in Detroit. There was another in San Antonio, Albany. I think there are two others, Chicago as well. And the question is, how do you define a class? But the broader question for an economist is, what is an occupation? Well, I'm very, very narrow. I think occupation for me is full professors of economics. I mean, which is what I was for quite a long time. But is it professors? Is it professors of economics? Do I want to be in the same class as sociologists? Heaven help me. But again, it's a tough, tough question. The other question to ask, let's say you defined a class, and let's say we observe in some well-defined class that wages are identical. Do identical wages mean are they evidence of wage fixing? Well, Kenneth Arrow, who people may know of, he won the 4th Nobel Prize in economics, made the point that perfect competition in a market yields prices that are identical. So are identical wages indicative of wage fixing, or are they indicative of a market that works so well that everybody gets the same wage given their same skills? I don't know the answer to that, but it's a kind of philosophical question which to me as a labor person thinking about things a bit more broadly, I find fascinating, and people should think about that some more. Anyway, that's all I had. My colleague Yi here will go on.
This is working. Actually, what Dan just mentioned about the occupation in terms of professors of economics, that does remind me of several cases that I worked on that was quite a debate in terms of how to analyze pay equity in the higher education in the university, whether you want to group all the professors from different departments together. So Dan has talked a lot about these overall trends in labor force participation, unemployment, job vacancies. So underneath these overall trends, actually there are a lot of heterogeneities that we care about. There are a lot of differences across different groups, and I think in the next few minutes I'm actually going to focus on the differences across all these type of groups. These differences and the way that these differences are evolving can potentially impact how the labor and employment cases go forward. So I'm going to start with the population diversity. So whether or how you're going to deal with diversity legally, or how you want to define diversity legally, as a matter of fact, it is happening, and it is happening faster than we anticipated. So here's a graph that shows over the last, I think, 5 census data, 5 waves of census data, you see a very steady declining of the share of whites and increasing share of the minorities. Based on the very recent census data, more than 4 out of the 10 Americans identified as non-whites, and if you compare to only 40 years ago, and that's a huge difference. And this is not really a sort of a regional problem. There are regional variations in sort of the degree of diversity, how the diversity is evolving, but essentially the declining of the white shares in the population happens in every single state. And even more interestingly, things sort of, it looks different if you compare sort of the older people versus the younger people. So most noteworthy is the increase of diversity in the younger portion of the population. So the graph on the left here, so the first one was the overall diversity, and then the second bar graph in there is actually the diversity picture for people under the age of 16. And in 2019, that's actually the first time that if you look at the population under the age of 16, more than half of the population there actually identified as minority. And the two maps on the right tells you the exact same story. So that's the diversity index score, which is essentially tells what's the probability that two randomly chosen individuals from each state are from different race and ethnicity groups. And so the darker the maps are, the more diverse the population is. So I divided it as based on the age, so over 18 versus under 18, and this tells the exact same story as those bar charts. The younger generation are more diverse, so which seems to us that the diversifying the population happens in accelerating pace in the United States. So this really serves as a backdrop of all the of a lot of the cases that we're working on. So from the population to the workforce. So this graph actually shows the four major race and ethnicity groups, and over time how their employment to population ratio evolves. So one thing that I do want to point out is the difference between black and white. Over the last 50 or 60 years, as you can see there, the share of black population in employment is consistently lower than the share of white population with paid jobs. But that trend actually started to converge in the recent decades. Actually, it reversed a little bit I think in 2023, there was 1 month that actually the employment to population ratio of blacks is actually taking over the whites, as you can see here. So many have offered different explanations. So one potential explanation is the age structure. So the population age of black is younger than the population age of white. So even though you see that the employment to population ratio of blacks overall is actually getting very close to white, but if you actually looking at different age groups separately, you still see the gap between white and black. So the employment to population ratio of white is still higher than the blacks for each age groups. But when you lump them together, because the age structure of the white population is older than the blacks, and that's one of the reasons why you see that overall employment to population ratio in the most recent years is actually blacks is converging to whites, and in some months it's actually overtaking whites. And the other reason is actually I would call it traumatic recovery of employment for black population after the pandemic, because as you can see there they did relatively better than many of the other racial groups. So this gives you the picture of the differences across racial groups in the labor force participation. Another dimension of the diversity I want to talk about is the age. So we're going to focus on the graph on the left here. As you can see, over the last 40 or 50 years, there's a steady increase in the proportion of older worker over the age of 55 in the labor force. And many explanations, of course, have been offered to explain this. The population structure, the baby boomers, as well as the increase in the age that you can claim full Social Security benefit, as well as the changing nature of the retirement plan from defined benefits to defined contribution. And all of these factors can somewhat explain this increased older worker in the labor force. So all of these significant changes in the employment situation across various groups, of course, one other aspect is the pay. So since the early 1980s, this country has experienced a sharp increase in earnings and income inequality and wealth inequality. And that inequality has sort of tapered off after the 2000s, but many explanations have been offered to explain that huge increase in inequality in the 1980s, 1990s, and to the early period of 2000s. if you sum up all those explanations, it can explain 300% of the inequality. But most economists agree that the most important factor in all of this is the steep rise in earnings inequality across education groups. So we talked a lot lately about whether it's worthwhile to go to college and stuff like that. So this graph actually tells the story it's well worth to go to college. So as you can see there, there's a sharp increase in the earnings of the college and beyond population. And from 1980 to now, you actually see a decline of real earnings for the non-college degree holders. And that seems to be one of actually the most important driver behind inequality over the last 40 years. And of course, education plays a more important role in the inequality increase between the 1980s to 2000s. Its importance declined, so 75% of the inequality due to this education gap. And for now, it's more around 40%, but it's by no means disappeared. So there's still a huge college premium at play that drives the inequality in this country that we should remember that when we talk about, whether we should go to college or not. And of course, there are other explanations. I think one of them is Dan has mentioned, the deunionization, and also the long period of time that the minimum wage didn't change, and of course, the globalization. And also, one thing that you will hear a lot of economists talk about is this called the skill bias or technical change being an explanation for the inequality, meaning that with the computer and with the IT started to develop since the early 1980s, is really disproportional benefit the skilled worker, the highly educated worker. So there is a race, so to borrow a term from Larry Katz and Claudia Go, there's a race between education and technology. So between the 1980s and 2000s, it's very clearly that the technology has won that race. So the technology has disproportionately benefited the high-skilled workers, but the higher education or the education sector didn't supply enough highly educated workers into the labor market. So the demand is higher than the supply, so that bids up the price. So that's how you see the change in the inequality in those years. So, and from inequality, the things that some of us are really care about, the gender and race pay gap here. So even with these inequalities sharply increased during the 1980s and 1990s, and we see a gradual increase in the equality of pay between the genders. And I do want to mention that these are just raw salaries. These are sort of very different than the picture that we get when we do these pay equity studies day in and day out. So none of these numbers take into account the various factors legitimately explain the pay differences between gender and race. And as you can see that the pay gap has been sort of flattening out since the early 2000s. So it's around 80 cents per dollar male makes, that's what female makes, up to around 82 cents per dollar. And it's a little bit different for the race picture here. And we see Asian male as well as Asian female are out earning white groups, but the blacks and Hispanics are still, again, for the raw earnings are lower than the white, which is the trend here. And the other topic that I want to touch very briefly on is AI, automation. It seems like you can't go to any labor and employment conferences these days without touching on the AI topic. So I want to sort of change a little bit of an angle to talk about this, put AI in the bigger context of technology change over time. So the technology change, the automation has sharply increased productivity of labor in the last few decades. And it's a good thing in terms of when it comes to the production. And we need to, of course, be careful about these various biases that we have been discussing so lively over the last few years. One other thing that I want to mention when it comes to this automation is that if you take a look at the graph on the left here, the impact of the impact of automation in the labor markets is really different for different groups. So, and it mostly depends on the kind of jobs and occupations that these different groups have. Although overall, it's around 20% of the US workers are going to be impacted by this automation trend, there are a lot of differences between gender, there's a lot of differences between race and education level. So when we think about how automation is going to impact the evolvement of the labor market, we should really sort of uncover the heterogeneities sort of underneath. So how does that impact men versus women? How does that going to impact the different race groups, so on and so forth. So the very last thing that I want to talk about, which I have some slides about the way that we do AI bias audit, disparate impact analysis. The 4/5 rule, I think a lot of you are familiar with. I want to transition to the very last thing I want to talk about is pay transparency and pay equity, which I think is what the topic of the next session is. So there are a lot of debate on various pay transparency laws in various states nowadays. They're taking on various forms. And what labor economists care about is how does this sort of a revealing of information, how does this pay transparency movement going to impact the overall wage or the pay disparities between different groups. So there are some preliminary evidence now in labor economics as we just started to have these pay transparency legislation not too long ago. So these economists they're comparing states that has pay transparency law at one point versus the state that not having it. And they compare various labor market outcomes across these two types of states. And what's the consensus for now is that it seems like these pay transparency laws does reduce the pay gap, at least between genders. But at the same time, they also have uncovered some unintended consequences of these pay transparency laws. One of them is it seems like the overall average wage level has been decreased due to these laws, as well as some effects on the productivity, on the incentive, and on the performance pay system in the workforce. So I guess that's all I wanted to discuss today.
I thank the conference for giving me my easiest gig ever, is watching these two experts talk about what they were talking about. Dan, I just want to observe, it's not just legislation proposed by Bernie Sanders that doesn't get through the Congress. We have a non-functioning federal legislature. We do. The last labor employment law of any significance that was passed by them was GINA, Gender Information Non-Discrimination, and that was in 2008. And we have a lot of states who are just fine with the fact that we have a non-functioning federal legislature. We have other states who care about the workplace and they pass laws. And so that's why that minimum wage chart that you had is such a no, it's not quite a checkerboard. There's quite a large area. If you do red states,
perhaps.
if you do red states, blue states, it kind of would line up with the minimum wage map that you had, I think. And the pay equity is also a thing. That's state by state. There's no federal legislation. You know, you can extrapolate Title VII and go on and, and figure out we get to pay equity. And Lord knows the EEOC's tried to do that over the years. But we do have states that have very serious pay equity analysis. Like in New Jersey, for example, you have Short Hills, which is a very wealthy community, and you have South Jersey, which is not so wealthy. And under the New Jersey law, you're not allowed to take into account geographic dispersion. Short Hills, Vineland, two completely different towns. Housing is a lot cheaper in Vineland. You don't have to pay as much in Vineland, but under the pay equity analysis in New Jersey, you can't take that into account, apparently. But in other states like New York, you can. And you do a lot of pay equity analysis, right? And that's what you do.
Yes.
Okay. And so how do you account for the regulations of the different states?
So yes, what you have explained is sort of what kind of factors can be taken into account when we run these pay equity regressions, right? So you are examining the pay, and then you are sort of putting all the potential explanatory factors into the right hand of your model. You know, the type of jobs, how many years that you have been in the job, and what's your labor market experience, so on and so forth, and sometimes performance ratings and stuff like that. So what we do is we recognize that different states allows in different type of factors to be taken into account. And when we do these analysis, we usually provide a wide range of models where you have different estimates of pay equity situation based on different control factors in the model, meaning that are we holding job groups constant? Are we only looking at people in the same job family? Are we only looking at people who have a performance rating equal to 5, and so on and so forth? So, and we're providing to the console all of these different options, and I think at the end of the day, it's up to the console how to argue which model should be the one that put forward.
Yeah, I find a lot of pushback from companies. I recommend, you know, do the pay equity analysis, and a lot of companies just don't want to do it. A, it's not cheap, and B, they're scared to death about what they might find. But my point is, better you find it about yourself than have a plaintiff tell you, you know, what you're doing is wrong. I want to open the floor to any questions out there. We're almost out of time. Sam. We're almost out of time. I just want to there was a graph that was startling to me with the graduate degree. That was very, very much higher than others in terms of earnings. And I got some clarification on that, and that's equalizing, you know, adjusting for inflation. But it's still, it was just shocking to see if you have a graduate degree, you're doing much, much, much better than people who don't have graduate degrees in terms of comp. I'll end it there.